Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinAbox.com. Today we're going to be rebuilding the Bosch alternator, popular on Dodge Ram. The family of Bosch alternator that we're working on here specifically is recognizable and identifiable by the 15mm nut holding the plastic back on, and they always have the serial number and the identification numbers in the amperage rating printed in the flat area above the rear bearing. To take the rear plastic cover off, there's a Phillips head down in here, and take the 15mm socket to take the rear nut off. Some of these models have a built-in regulator like this one. Probably fits cars like Volvo or Mercedes, and it'll have 3 Phillips holding it on. So you'll have a Phillips head here, here, and here that you have to take off to remove the voltage regulator brush holder assembly. The Mopars have an external voltage regulator, so there'll be only 2 Phillips head screws holding it on. You take it off, take those screws out, and pull this assembly backwards like this, and the brushes are still attached. So there's a shot of the voltage regulator / brush holder assembly, and there it is removed. The next step is to take the 4 bolts out that hold it together. There's 4 bolts on the exterior. There's one, and this one over here. The best way to take those off is with a 5/16. Try not to use a Phillips head. Just get a 5/16 socket and break those loose and take them out. Now we need to tap one apart by placing one hand on the rear plate assembly and tapping on the front plate with a hammer. You'll notice that we removed the windings and everything with the rear plate assembly, and we're going to want to tap the rear bearing retainer out. Here's the rear bearing plastic retainer. You'll notice that the opening on it faces where the brush holder was, so when you put that back in there, you'll want to take note of that. Also, there are 3 lineup teeth that have corresponding areas underneath. Now we need to remove the rear pulley. Hold on with your left hand with a pair of gloves onto the outside diameter of the pulley. Then use a 1/2 inch impact and a 15/16 socket. There's a lock washer, like a wave washer, and the nut, and the pulleys usually come right off. If not, stick a couple screwdrivers behind it and pry it off. Also, you can use a little bit of rust bust down in on the shaft to help it if it's a little rusty. Place the alternator upside down in a vise with the jaws open enough so that there's a gap between the rotor and the jaws of the vise, but the rear plate is supported by the jaws of the vise. Spray your favorite brand of rust bust on the shaft. Wait 5 minutes. Put the pulley nut back on the front threads. Lay a 2x4 over the top . Be extremely cautious during this operation to ensure that the slip ring where the brushes ride doesn't come in contact with the adjusting bar at the bottom of the vise. This is the spacer that's behind the pulley that was left over after we removed the shaft. This is the outside, the part that's towards the pulley. You'll always notice a little bit of rust on that surface. This part with the smaller index on it will be the part that goes towards the inside, the part that touches the bearing. What we need to do is remove the 4 Phillips head screws that are holding the bearing in, and there's kind of a trick to it because a lot of times when you're trying to remove them, they're not going to just come right out. You have to more or less break them loose, and if you just try and do it without this little trick first, more than likely you're going to ruin the head and end up having to drill out in it. So what we do is tap it from the rear. And that helps loosen them up so that the X in the Phillips head doesn't strip out on you. There's the bearing cover that's been removed and the 4 screws that hold it together. So now we're going to tap the rear bearing, the front bearing, out of the front plate. And you can use a socket to do that. You don't necessarily, unless you feel pretty sure about your skill, have to do that with the hammer itself. You could put a 3/4 socket on it and then tap on the socket itself. At this point, what we want to do is take this plate and prepare it for the installation of the new bearing, and we're going to do that by putting it in an oven, heat it for about 20 minutes at 350, and continue with the rest of the rebuild while that's going on. Spray your favorite brand of rust bust on the inner race of the rear bearing. Occasionally on some alternators we'll be faced with a bearing that needs to be removed from the shaft. The tool that makes this job the easiest and a worthy investment for any shop is a Dremel. You'll be needing a reinforced cutoff wheel. The Dremel and the reinforced cutoff wheel are available at any big box store, Lowe's, Home Depot, or even a Walmart. Draw a line on the outside race of the bearing on one side, and then 180 on the other side. Draw another line. We're going to use the Dremel wheel to cut along that line. We've cut through the one side. We're going to turn it to the other side and cut the other outside half of the race. After the outer race and the balls in the cage have been removed, we need to deal with the inner race. Basically following the same procedure. One method, if you can get a grinder in there or a grinding wheel, you can grind a piece off the side so that it gets down to the shaft and it relieves the tension on the inner race. We prefer to use our Dremel for this in the same fashion. I've scribed a line and then you scribe another line on the other side 180 away from this one and use the Dremel to cut it off. After you get it most of the way cut through, the actual race itself is so brittle you can take a chisel and just hit it quickly with a hammer and it'll shatter off. If you have a little bit of collateral damage on the shaft itself or up into the rotor body, it's of no significance. As always, eye protection is a must. Okay, the front plate has been in the oven for 20 minutes, and you can also put the new bearing in the freezer for a little while if you want to, but at that point you're ready just to drop the bearing in. Then reinstall the bearing cover and the 4 bolts after the unit is cooled. We're going to clean up the slip ring on the rotor. You don't actually want to take any metal off, just clean everything up a little bit with a piece of sandpaper. Choose a deep well socket from your selection. You have to choose properly and carefully because this deep well socket is going to be used as a rear bearing installation tool. First, we have to perform 2 tests with the socket to make sure that we select the right one. The first test is we're going to be installing by tapping on the center race, because when you tap a bearing onto a shaft, you always tap on the center race. When you're tapping it into a plate, you tap on the outer race. But the socket has to be the inside diameter roughly the same as the inside diameter on the inner race of the bearing. The other thing that the socket has to be tested for is you have to put it on the slip ring and make sure that it goes down far enough without interfering or hurting any of the copper as you tap on. In this particular case, we have a impact socket at 3/4, but sizes will vary from kit to kit or manufacturer to manufacturer. So choose a tool wisely as long as they fit the 2 outlines of criteria that I just told you about. The same inside diameter as the inner race, and that there is no interference with the slip ring. Then you're ready to put a little bit of oil on the shaft and then install the rear bearing. Sand the drive-in shaft so that the bearing can be installed easily. You don't actually want to remove any metal, just polish it up. Then put a few drops of oil on it and spread it around with your finger. Usually the bearing falls right on, but you can use a similar tool to the other tool that you used to tap on the rear bearing. Now we're going to be installing the spacer on the drive-in behind the pulley. Remember that the biggest side goes out, and that'll be the side with the rust on it. Those go on pretty tight, so you have to use your socket tool to tap it down into place. Installing the pulley is pretty much the opposite of the way it was removed. Put the pulley on first, then the lock washer, and then get the nuts started. Use your 1/2" impact with 15/16 and wear a glove with your left hand. Install the new rear bearing retainer, keeping mindful that the opening for the brush holder has to face the 2 mountings for the brush holder. You can see the 3 lineup pins, which lines up on the inside of the alternator. We're tapping it in gently with the hammer handle. You can put a little bit of oil on the plastic piece to make it go in easier. Be mindful of the yellow lineup marks when you set the rear plate assembly back on the front plate assembly. As you're tapping it back together, don't tap on the rectifier area where the plastic is. If it won't go back together for you, you can put a little bit of grease on the metal part of the stator winding laminations, or you can just finish it off by putting the through bolts back in and gradually tighten them up using a cross pattern. At this point, we're ready to hold the alternator in one hand and spin it to make sure that everything's spinning freely. If it doesn't spin freely and you meet with a little bit of resistance or a little bit of a tick, It's not really anything to worry about. You can tap on the outside with a hammer and retighten the through bolts to get rid of some of the clicking if you have a severe case. But generally after you install, it's going to correct itself anyway. If you have a built-in regulator, then there'll be 3 screws to put the regulator back on. For Dodge Ram, there'll only be the 2 longer ones. Now we're ready to put the voltage regulator back on and put the 2 or 3 Phillips head screws back into position. At this point, we're almost ready to put the rear cover on. Let's take a moment and make sure that all the Phillips head screws are tight. There's 2 holding the rectifier down that we didn't disturb, but we want to just assure that everything's tight there. And then this is a good time to go ahead and just double check the voltage regulator or brush holder hold down screws before we finish everything up. And we're ready to put the plastic cover back on. There's the 1 Phillips screw and then the 2 15mm nuts. Tighten everything down and we're done.